It's my impression that very few public defenders can do for their clients what you did for Dante, because they have hundreds and hundreds of open cases, and they need to just plead out. So how would you respond to this? That it's unrealistic?
Really, one of the tragedies in this country is what you described, and we have lawyers who are facing 400 and 500 caseloads of 400 or 500 clients at a time. We have lawyers, there's courtrooms throughout the South especially, but not only in the South, where they have what Steve Bright, the capital defense attorney, calls the meet 'em and plead 'em lawyers. They meet the client, and the lawyers already arranged the plea agreement, so they meet the client, and then they plead the client. So there's none of this that I even described. This is a dream world in much of the country. It's true that I worked at an office. I worked at the Public Defender Service in D.C., which is one of the most well-funded public defender offices in the country. We still thought we were underfunded and overworked as compared to the prosecutors, but compared to nationwide, no, it's not there. So it's not what I described as a model of indigent defense. Only will work if we invest in that sort of funding. But I would say, one of the things that I think, sort of to connect to what Professor Bibas was saying, is that the legitimacy, a basic conservative principle is this notion that it's conservative and liberal, but this idea that the system is going to be legitimate and needs to be perceived as legitimate by the people that are going through it. For any of the punishment to be understood as anything other than just a racket, right, is you have to have processes that are fair, and that includes a lawyer who knows you, who is willing to investigate your case, and is able to fight for you. It's not the only thing, but anything close to the only reform. And in D.C., and indeed my own practice in D.C. would tell you that if a lot of other things are broken, we have sky-high incarceration rates in D.C., even with a good public defender's office. So it's not good enough on its own, but it is essential.
And can I I've been thinking a lot about this issue, and I think it's important to understand the scope of how badly funded it is. We spend about $200 billion a year on criminal justice. We spend $4 billion a year nationwide on indigent defense, despite the fact that 80% of all defendants facing prison time qualify for an indigent defense lawyer, right? 2%. They get public defenders, we spend less on public defense than we do on prosecutors, even though prosecutors get all their investigatory services for free, right? The prosecutors have an arm for investigation. It's called the police department. They don't pay for that. But the defense attorney wants to investigate something about his client, that comes out of their budget, right, which they don't have. Things are so bad, the New York Times had an article recently about how small counties are what's driving mass incarceration today. Dearborn County, Indiana, population 30,000, found $20 million to expand his jail and his courts to handle more drug cases. The entire state of Indiana as a whole spends about $60 billion a year on indigent defense, $60 million on indigent defense. Dearborn County finds $20 million to build out its jail. The state spends $60 million, 3 times as much for a state with 3 million people versus a county of 50,000 people. Right? We have the money. Dearborn County had enough to fund 1/3 of the entire state's indigent defense budget, but they spend it on jails and courtrooms, not on indigent defense. Right? And so it is a huge crisis. We're at the point now where 43 states make the poor pay for their own indigent defense lawyer, at least part of it. In North Dakota, you are charged $95 an hour as a poor person for your indigent defense lawyer, and if you cannot pay that bill, even if you are acquitted, that's a crime. So it is a serious, profound crisis that we face, and we have the money for it. We just opt not to spend it.
My question was in relation to the Brock Turner case that blew up recently, where he served only 3 months for what was a very violent sexual crime. How do you think sensationalized cases like this, where it seems someone was not necessarily brought to justice for his crime, affects the overall issues of overcriminalization and mass incarceration?
I think many of the problems we have are from unrepresentative sensational crimes, and the public has a very skewed sense of what the run-of-the-mill ordinary crimes are. The more abstract we are about criminal justice, the more pessimistic I am, because people have these stereotypes in their mind they fill in, or they've heard some story like the Brock Turner. The more we can push things down to the jury and individual case level or the neighborhood level, the less there's going to be that general paranoia or speculation. But a case like that can drive the whole crime of carjacking, or there are all kinds of bills we can talk about that came out of particular panics, and unfortunately the media know that it sells newspapers, eyeballs, etc. If it bleeds, it leads. And so the media are very opportunistic in playing this kind of thing up, even though it can really skew what how policy makes sense in an individual, much more typical case.
I would love to hear each of you speak about what ethical work programs look like in prisons. Is it ethical for public companies like AT&T to use prison labor? And then Professor Bibas, if you'll speak to the child support aspect of work and what that would look like.
It's an interesting question. I'm troubled that my goal is to kind of transition people back into some kind of social responsibility. I think prisoners ought to keep some of the money they make, that they ought to have some reward and encouragement for what they do. They have some sense that they have some responsibility to their family, a fraction, maybe a quarter of what they earn. Maybe some of it go towards victims. They're not going to be able to repay all of a victim's hospital bills. They may not be able to pay all of their family's child support. Some of this is going to be symbolic, but the goal is, fiscally, I don't know how big an amount this will be, but it communicates something about this person's remaining connected to the victim, connected to the family. The ethical issues are substantial, and we do know that convict leasing during the Jim Crow era was a problem, and it mustn't look, racialized. Some friends are convinced, you don't want something that looks like the chain gangs of old look like, but you can have humane working conditions. You can have, I don't think the wage rates have to be market rate, because working with security costs in prison makes that prohibitive. But I can imagine a system that's open enough to outside inspection to monitor abuses, that's voluntary, and that gives prisoners an option. And my understanding is most prisoners, given the option, want these kinds of work assignments, and they tend to be favored things that get revoked for disciplinary violations that wardens, et cetera, find has leverage. So if the fact that the prisoners want to do it is an indication, and the fact that they benefit from it, those seem to be substantial ethical considerations in its favor.
So I'm drawn to it and very concerned about it at the same time. I mean, I think, to me, the biggest issue is what are people, so we tend to focus a lot on how much people are earning in the moment. And I care about that, because people need to be not, it needs to not be like what we've seen happen in the past. But almost my bigger concern is, what are people being trained for? So when you have my experience, I mean, this is obviously a totally different context, but I'll just share, when we started our charter school with kids from the juvenile justice system, all of my clients told me, like, I want a job. Like, that was their number one thing. They wanted to work. They were desperate to work. And when we set up that, we started a catering business. And what I will tell you, and I'm not like the, clearly the best business person in the world, or I wouldn't be a law professor probably, but it is extremely hard to run a business that takes seriously training people, that treats them well, that has a vision that you're preparing people not just for a job in a particular industry, but you're actually preparing people for a lifetime of work, including in careers and jobs that are going to end up making them much more money over time, you hope and dream, than food service. right? That kind of training is expensive. Like the reason why, McDonald's, the reason why they have pictures of the meals on the cash registers instead of dollar signs is because so many of our industries are organized at making it as inexpensive as possible, right? And so that they don't have to train people. So my big fear with this is that the jobs that would end up being created would, one, be jobs that people weren't being very well compensated for at the time, but much bigger is they're not jobs that are training people for anything meaningful that exists out there in the world when they get out. If we were able to overcome those obstacles, then I'd be all in.
I think that's an important point. I've actually played with the idea of resurrecting, military service as an option, precisely because the military is a pathway that can lead to a lot of other different jobs. And there are a few people with serious violent tendencies, but historically in most societies it has been available as a punishment sometimes.
And I guess I would just say two things. It's not an issue I've thought much about, but one is I do believe in Germany where they do pay people for the work at like the market rate, right? It's not discounted for security, right? I think our prisons are poorly designed and poorly run. We don't have to be quite so security. We overstate, I think, security risk in most prisons, right? And so since other countries pay their workers the market rate, I think it takes away a lot of the ethical concerns. As for, I think, James raises a really important point about the cost of the programs, though. I think one thing you have to realize about prisons, so much of us have driven prison reform lately has been cost savings, right? This is expensive. We need to save money. Except when it comes to criminal justice, the things that's really appealing about prison is it's just so cheap, right? That on a grant from a fiscal dollar, what comes out of the state's budget, from a social cost point of view, is vastly, horrifically expensive. But from what does the state have to pay out of its own budget? Like we only spend 5% of the state budget goes to corrections, right? It's not this giant hoovering up of cash. And compared to things that actually work, like training programs, it's incredibly expensive. Right? Indiana just created a program we're going to take people out of prison for low level and send them to community programs to get trained, and we're going to use all the money we save from prisons to fund other programs. And all of a sudden say, wait, we're not saving money. We're spending money. And the prison's exactly, send them back, right? Because we're the cheap option, and they are. Right? I think that's the challenge, that sort of a cost-saving based movement, which is a big part that's brought a significant portion of the right wing into reform. It actually isn't going to work because prisons at the end of the day are the cheapest thing we have, not from a dollar point of view, and that's, I think, a serious thing is overlooking. So we're going to save money. We're not. It's cheap, and that's a serious concern.
I had a question, and maybe to answer the question, you might want to provide the audience with a little bit of background information. I've long been curious whether the current narrative about mass incarceration, whether there's a correlation between this narrative and renewed interest in the theory of rehabilitation as the primary purpose of punishment. Because it's my sense that mass incarceration starts to develop as a problem when rehabilitation as the primary purpose of punishment becomes on the defensive in about the 1980s. That rehabilitation as the principal purpose of punishment is being rethought today. And many people are very sympathetic to that, as opposed to three other common justifications for punishment, namely retribution, deterrence, and incapacitation. I think people now, especially Christians, say, well, punishment really should rehabilitate. Maybe that's the primary purpose of punishment. And whether among the legal scholars, and whether there's any survey results indicating that more Americans are favorably disposed to rehabilitation as the principal purpose of punishment. That is, you punish with the goal of making a person fit to re-enter society. There's a kind of moral transformation that would take place, and this, of course, would be very congenial to Christians. I'd welcome all your perspectives on this.
I mean, I guess I would start by saying understanding what happened in the 70s and 80s that caused it to start is so mind-bendingly complicated that to try to say, well, it's all tied to this one changing philosophy of punishment is too hard to say, right? I mean, we lack data to really nail down what happened. There's so much going on all at once. I mean, I'm sure I'd be more comfortable saying they're probably tied to a general underlying common cause, right? Which is that starting in the 1970s, although our official starting in 1960, although our official stats actually overstate this, crime started going up. And they overstate it because we actually understate crime in the 60s, where he systematically underestimated crime compared to today. So the jump between 60 and 80 in like the 90s looks bigger than it really was, just because things are actually worse in the 60s than our official numbers say. And I think that rise led to a loss of faith in rehabilitation. I can't remember when Martingale.
74.
Right, so the big paper tied to like the loss of faith is a paper sort of called the Nothing Works paper. That's like 74. And I, as an academic, I can't admit this one paper matters. Right, nothing we write matters that much. Right, the reason why that paper matters is clearly he was tapping into what people were already thinking. Right, so by 74, already we're losing faith in rehabilitation because crime is going up and going pretty, and we're having a hard time managing it, right? So you see rehabilitation die during that time, you see retribution come in during that time, but it's tied, I think, in large part to this underlying rise in crime, and then all the other giant social upheavals of the 60s and 70s. And generally, social upheaval leads to a generally sort of repressive attitude in people, right? So you have civil rights, the oil crisis, 1,000 other things happening all at once. And so to try to isolate what was causing it, I think more we see is retribution as the official punch, although within prisons it never faded nearly as much as people thought because wardens like things to keep people busy. It was part of, I think, a broader general sort of loss of faith in the state's ability to work, tied to social upheaval and to just rising crime.
Yeah, so I don't, like John, I don't know that we can tell a clear story on this point in about the early 1970s. I certainly know, my grandmother was a writer, and she wrote about prisons, and she was a big critic of rehabilitation. And so I've always, she's not with us anymore, but I think about her a lot. And she spent time with prisoners in Arkansas and Washington, D.C., and they were incredibly critical of rehabilitation for a lot of the reasons, right, that the left was critical at that point in time, which is this idea that it was the state further controlling you, and there were people that had indeed paid the debt that they should have paid based on any fair assessment, but now they were being held further inside because they refused to go along with a series of programs that they didn't believe in, et cetera. So there was that left critique to accompany the Martinson, Nothing Works critique. I spent a lot of time with my students on this precise issue in the class that I taught in the prison, and the law students were much more enamored of the term rehabilitation than the incarcerated students were. And the incarcerated students had a lot of the similar, and this is a data set of 10, let's be clear, but they had a lot of the similar criticisms that I remember reading in my grandmother's book from the early 1970s. We ended up as a class deciding on this notion of opportunity. And that was the term that sort of we just kind of collectively, and I've been increasingly using in my own kind of speaking about this, is that people need to, while they're in prison, and when they get out of prison, they need to be provided opportunities. As opposed to rehabilitation. And maybe it's just semantic, maybe it's like liberal becomes progressive and we're all talking about the same thing. I'm not really sure. But the notion of opportunity was more appealing to my students, and I think increasingly has becoming more appealing to me as a way of talking about what we should aspire to provide as the state and society to people who have been locked up or people who have been convicted of crimes.
The only thing I want to add to that, I'll defer to them on the genealogy and the timeline, which sound about right, but I want to question a little bit your identification with a Christian congeniality to punishment with rehabilitation. Rehabilitation has classically been understood as a set of psychological interventions that involve job training and a kind of a medicalized treatment model. And I understand the Christian approach to be more of a moral reform, a focus on metania, or a deep repentance or change of heart that ought to be connected to things like, learning some kind of structure and self-discipline and other things. But it's a different focus from what was the medicalized model in the middle of the century that doesn't appear to work on those terms.
I was wondering what your thoughts are on solitary confinement, which is known to have degenerative effects on prisoners, but it's often used as a stick to kind of incentivize prisoners to have good behavior. So I was wondering if you thought there was any kind of alternative within prison systems to solitary confinement. Thank you.
I think they have plenty of other sticks. Apparently just threatening people with having to eat Nutriloaf is sufficient, which is this horrible concoction of oatmeal and other stuff that's nutritionally filling but apparently tastes like eating cardboard. My understanding is prison administrators feel like they have plenty of sticks that will keep a lot of people in line just to keep their few percent of good time credits and the like. But I've never done a study of it.
So here's what's kind of amazing about this conversation in the United States, right? We're starting from what's the alternative to solitary confinement, a psychologically devastating punishment. And the best solution was first we come up with this Nutriloaf, which is this disgusting mashed meal of junk. Anders Breivik was a Norwegian who shot and killed, he shot 160 people, killed 50 children on the island in Norway, Norway, right? Was that what happened?
Yep.
One of the worst crimes Norway has ever experienced. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. Interesting to look at what Anders Breivik's prison cell is. His prison cell, for a man who committed mass murder, has no bars on it. It has 3 rooms, it has a kitchen, it has a TV, it has an Xbox, yet despite all of that, it was ruled as being as impermissibly violative as human rights by the EU High Court, right? Court of Human Rights, right? That was still, despite having multiple rooms, a kitchen, and a TV, still viewed for a mass murder as oppressive. That's Norway. We're debating solitary confinement versus Nutriloaf in the United States. That looks nothing, Europeans find our prisons incomprehensible. And they have found our prisons incomprehensible since Dickens came over here and said, what the hell am I looking at, right? So this is not like this is something new for us. And it's not like European prisons are these unmanageable pits of despair where the inmates run the institution because lacking the threat of solitary confinement and Nutriloaf, how else can you possibly manage someone, right? But that is where our discourse here has somehow plummeted. I don't mean to say on Nutriloaf. That is where we debate. The very fact that we have to debate this shows just how radically unique, and I do not mean that in a good way, our view of what constitutes appropriate and adequate incarceration is. So yeah, I think it's terrible. And there's other things obviously we should be doing. I just think we should understand that the very fact of having to ask that question and think of what other kind of not quite so nasty alternatives could we use, that is how how all of us approach this question versus what happens in other countries that still seem to run fairly well-managed prisons is pretty striking, right? And I think it gets this idea that the United States, more than most other countries, committing a crime is viewed as violating the social contract in a way that basically excises you from the analysis altogether, right? You even see it in the analysis of the 2015 crime statistics, which is the huge brewing fight these days, right? But there's this big debate. Is this jump in murders terrible, or is this jump in murders nothing, right? But the thing that seems to get overlooked in this entire debate, even by the analysis that are supposed to be sort of the very well-informed ones, is that no one ever actually pays attention to the cost of punishment, right? Not the dollar cost of prison, but if we overreact to this murder rise, we will punish more people, and we will punish them needlessly, excessively, and that excessive punishment has a huge cost too. The risk of dying from a drug overdose skyrockets upon release from prison, right? Because in prison you're not adequately trained, not adequately treated, but drugs are expensive and lower quality. You get out of prison, cheaper, higher quality, you overdose. 1 year in prison takes 2 years off your life in the expectation within at least the first 10 or 15 years. It disrupts marriages, it disrupts families, it disrupts jobs, right? But none of that seems to matter in our analysis. Right? The question is, well, 1,500 more people died. I've been told that I don't care about those people who have died. Right? I've had law professors tell me that why are you rationalizing death, right? By saying we shouldn't panic over this. Because other people die in response to it, right? But we don't seem to care about those, right? Solitary confinement and Nutriloaf are fine for those people, right? And you can obviously put the racial balance on those people that it deserves. And I just find it's a staggering conversation where we simply ignore these costs in their entirety, right? And I guess I would just end by reminding, as someone who teaches at Jesuit school, talking something here, the very last act that Jesus did in his life was not to forgive a low-level, nonviolent wine smuggler, right? That wasn't the person next to him on the cross. It was a murderer, right? That's who he forgave. And for a country that brags about its evangelicalism and looks at sort of soulless, faithless Europe with condescension and scorn, right? Keep in mind, Anders Breivik has a cell with 3 rooms. We debate solitary confinement.
Let's thank our guests for tonight. Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Let me tell you what's going to happen next. So when you leave tonight, you will be receiving an email very shortly that will have links and articles that these gentlemen have written. so that this can begin the process of starting a new conversation. If Michelle Alexander was considered the first phase of the public discourse on mass incarceration, overcriminalization, the second phase will begin with the scholars that we have here. And it is because you are here tonight that you are getting to participate in that conversation. So thank you so much for coming, and good night.